It's the end of outsourcing to other companies and purchasing inexpensive products, stated President's spouse as she canceled a contract. It was a big yes customer, and I felt the small shock of worries. And that's when I had a great idea. Understood. I signed the extended man contract she handed me and said, "We will never drive to you again." After that, the president went back, and his wife returned to our corporation, looking so shocked. My name is Mia. I am 37 years old, and I run my grandfather's company, a solid business with good repeat customers. I invest in business to preserve this company and the jobs of its employees. Therefore, I read all day about economics of development. The products are precision mechanical equipment. Production of complex machine elements is our core business. We have people who work for us that were with my grandfather and know things I will never catch up to. I often go to the site and study right from them. This dogged commitment has won their respect, and in spite of my youth, their confidence. I have always believed in giving my full 110% to all of my clients, which is why the company that I took from its dramatic lows has never performed better. However, there is still room for growth. I have more to learn in order for me to earn the rest of it and keep them interested, and this is what I need to do if our company wants us both. And then something amazing happened in the company. It started when the president of an important client's wife showed up. She was honestly shocked that she allegedly has known her husband's contact point for years at our company and never knew it report to someone in a younger person. I was now looking into the face of none other than Mrs. Brown from one of our largest contracts, going all the way back to my granddad's day, and that penetrating stare reflected that she did not like what I'd said. The woman, Mrs. Brown, said it was something her husband hosts for an annual holiday. It was not an all-ordinary event, but big occasion and loft of every times for entire their commercial partners. They had it written in the calendar like a long-planned event to come, and this year I got an invitation finally here all because my grandpa told me so. Mrs. Brown came out to chat with viewer and I, greeted various well-wishers as she made her way toward us atop the funeral home, showing me this should be a matter-of-fact visit on behalf of her husband. The president. This was actually my first time meeting Mrs. Brown, who otherwise usually stayed out of manager business. We gave our well wishes, were introduced to her, and thanked for several weeks of preferential treatment, and Mrs. Brown made an unexpected statement after pleasantries. "I have no idea how you got my husband on your side, but rest assured that one day you will pay." Mrs. Brown's warning left me bewildered. Her true meaning escaped me as I stood there, taken aback. Mrs. Brown smoothly transitioned to converse with another company president, her demeanor shifting significantly to radiate warmth and charm, leaving me perplexed about her abrupt animosity towards me. Feeling unsettled, the year-end party eventually drew to a close. Opting not to attend the after-party, I decided to seek answers from my parents. My parents and grandparents reside together in our family home, and I often turn to them for guidance. Upon my late arrival, I offered apologies, but my parents greeted me warmly, informing me that my grandfather was still awake. Eager for insight, I sought my grandfather's advice about Mrs. Brown's behavior and reputation. To my surprise, my grandfather painted Mrs. Brown as an exemplary figure, a devoted spouse who selflessly supported her husband and their son. The more I learned, the deeper my confusion about Mrs. Brown's sudden hostility grew. A few days post the after-party, Mrs. Brown made an unexpected visit to my company, catching my employees and secretary off guard. Since I wasn't present, she had to wait, which evidently did not sit well with her. "I'm the spouse of the president of one of this company's major clients. Is this how you treat valued guests? It's no wonder this company appears disorganized with a young woman at its helm," she remarked. From my perspective, Mrs. Brown's unannounced visit was an unreasonable action, but unfortunately I wasn't there to voice my opinion. Instead, my secretary bore the brunt of Mrs. Brown's frustration. By the time I returned, Mrs. Brown had departed, leaving a message with my secretary that she intended to return to offer a proper apology. Consequently, I scheduled a meeting with her for a later date. Upon entering the president's office, I anticipated encountering the president himself, only to be surprised by Mrs. Brown occupying the president's chair and exuding an air of superiority. I initiated the conversation by extending my apologies for my absence during her previous visit and expressed my willingness to address any concerns she had. What ensued was a revelation from Mrs. Brown that caught me off guard. "Goodbye to relying on inferior products from other suppliers," she said. For a moment, I found myself rendered speechless, likely wearing an expression of profound astonishment. Mrs. Brown's scowl deepened upon seeing my reaction. "A business under the management of someone as immature as you cannot be trusted. Moreover, your pricing is exorbitant for the quality you deliver," she declared, and terminating our contract to cut costs. Her accusations felt baseless, prompting a vehement rebuttal from me. I adamantly denied any overcharging and passionately defended the superior quality of our products, emphasizing their long-standing endorsement by the president. However, Mrs. Brown appeared unwilling to entertain my explanations. "The conceitedness of someone as immature as you is repulsive," she scoffed. When I inquired whether the president was aware of this decision, Mrs. Brown revealed that she was currently acting as the president. She explained that the president had been urgently summoned abroad to address issues in their production line, leaving her, as the vice president, to assume the role of acting president. It was then that I realized the reason behind the president's absence at the year-end party. "Tomorrow I'll bring all the necessary documents to terminate our contract with your company. Make sure you're there. I will not tolerate even a second's delay," Mrs. Brown asserted firmly. When I pressed her for the specific time of her arrival, she begrudgingly disclosed it. Leaving her company that day, I felt as though I was being forcibly shown the door. Their business was pivotal for us. Without them, meeting payroll could become a challenge. Burdened by a sense of urgency, I scrambled to devise strategies to prevent the impending contract termination. The following day, Mrs. Brown arrived promptly at my office. She placed the documents on my desk with a stern demeanor, urging me to sign without delay. "Please allow me to discuss this with the president," I implored. "There's no time for that. Both my husband and I lead busy lives. Unlike your modest operation, we are a major corporation. You should comprehend this being a fellow business owner," Mrs. Brown retorted dismissively. I seethed with anger at Mrs. Brown's patronizing tone. Her unilateral decision to terminate the contract was utterly unreasonable. Considering our long-standing business relationship, one would expect her, as a business owner, to grasp the magnitude of betrayal inherent in her actions. Yet there was no hint of remorse from Mrs. Brown. Frustrated by her arrogance, I resolved to enact the countermeasure I had pondered throughout the night. As a last resort, I posed a question to Mrs. Brown with genuine concern. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Mrs. Brown responded with a derisive laugh, mocking my inquiry. Observing her reaction, I couldn't help but smile. "Understood. We will cease all deliveries to your company," I affirmed briefly. Mrs. Brown displayed a flicker of hesitation at my swift acquiescence, but as soon as she witnessed me affixing my signature to the contract, she wore a triumphant smile, evidently satisfied. "Thank you. Our business dealings are now officially concluded," she declared with an air of self-satisfaction. Mrs. Brown departed, and as she exited, both my secretary and I bowed respectfully, concealing our inner amusement. I couldn't help but think that she should have scrutinized the documents more carefully. Once she was out of sight, I promptly composed a concise email to Mrs. Brown's husband, expressing appreciation for all past collaborations. I surmised that this alone would likely suffice for the president to discern the situation. Shortly thereafter, a call was received at my company. "Good day. I apologize for the sudden call. I was taken aback by your email. Could you shed some light on the situation? I'd appreciate a discussion if possible, perhaps in person." To the president's request, I casually assented. "Certainly, that can be arranged." A week later, the president arrived at my office, visibly uneasy, accompanied by Mrs. Brown, whose expression reflected evident displeasure. After formal greetings and light conversation, the president wasted no time inquiring about the contents of my email. Guiding him to a comfortable spot, I offered coffee before settling across from him, preparing to relay the tale. Anticipating it to be rather lengthy, I explained that Mrs. Brown had abruptly terminated our contract and that I felt it appropriate to express gratitude to the president for years of support before bidding farewell. As I candidly voiced my frustration, the president's complexion turned pale, and he swiftly extended a heartfelt apology. Mrs. Brown, visibly surprised, accompanied him with sweat gleaming on his brow. The president apologized earnestly, but Mrs. Brown, unsettled by his demeanor, stood beside him, her voice sharp as she rebuked him. "What are you doing apologizing to this inexperienced girl? Cease this immediately." Disregarding Mrs. Brown's objections, the president compelled her to offer an apology. Stealing a glance at his wife, he implored me, "Please reconsider terminating the contract. Our company depends heavily on yours. Losing your partnership would be a significant blow to us." He continued to apologize profusely. Mrs. Brown, glaring at her husband, directed her dissatisfaction towards me. "Even without this small company, our business won't suffer. I've already secured contracts with overseas firms to fill the gap. What's the issue?" Maintaining her assertive stance, Mrs. Brown's attitude left me sighing in frustration. Witnessing my reaction, the president was taken aback and then erupted into fury, scolding Mrs. Brown vehemently. "You're clueless. How could you act without considering the consequences? We've maintained a loyal relationship with this company for 40 years. Do you grasp the significance of that?" Mocking the president's sentiment, Mrs. Brown fired back. "So what? I'm not sentimental about old ties. Ending our association with this company will cut costs and enable us to lower our prices, gaining an edge over competitors. It's beneficial." The president's frustration escalated upon hearing Mrs. Brown's retort. "Allowing you to act as president was a mistake," he bellowed, his regret palpable, as Mrs. Brown smirked triumphantly in response. In the midst of their confrontation, Mrs. Brown's phone rang persistently. "I'm occupied at the moment," she snapped irritably into the phone. However, her demeanor swiftly shifted from annoyance to panic and bewilderment. "Hold on, what's happening?" With a sense of anticipation, I waited until Mrs. Brown concluded the call before inquiring, "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Brown, visibly overwhelmed, began to articulate her distress. "The overseas company we relied upon has encountered a 3-week delay, and the products received are of subpar quality." Unable to suppress a mocking laugh, I replied, "Such setbacks are unsurprising. Our precision mechanical equipment possesses unique attributes that other companies simply cannot replicate." "What do you mean?" she demanded, her tone edged with curiosity. "It's the craftsmanship," I asserted firmly, meeting Mrs. Brown's gaze with unwavering resolve. Though she appeared perplexed, I seized the moment to elucidate the profound significance of our company's refined technology and skilled craftsmanship. I emphasized how our products encompass unique techniques unattainable elsewhere, reliant on the expertise of our master craftsmen. As my confidence radiated, Mrs. Brown's expression shifted from defiance to frustration and resignation. With a triumphant air, I held my ground, meeting her defeated countenance with a sense of vindication. Having been vehemently vocal throughout our exchange, Mrs. Brown now seemed rendered speechless. Her demeanor subdued, I pressed her for an explanation. With defiant candor, she began to unravel her intentions, revealing a desire to secure her son's future by positioning him as the heir to the company. However, her husband's opposition led her to devise a plan, assuming the role of president temporarily to pave the way for her son's ascension. When an overseas issue emerged, Mrs. Brown saw an opportunity to sever ties with long-standing partners and forge new alliances, with her ultimate goal being to consolidate support for her son's succession. Unfortunately for her, my company stood as an obstacle to her scheme. She had sought alternative suppliers, but faced setbacks until now. Mrs. Brown's glare bore into the president, who sighed heavily, clearly exasperated. "You truly don't grasp the situation. Our son has no interest in inheriting this company." Mrs. Brown's shock was palpable as the president proceeded to disclose their son's true aspirations. "Our son has expressed a passion for agriculture, not business. He set his sights on attending agricultural college, not pursuing economics. That's why I kept it concealed, considering my brother's interest in assuming management." "It can't be," Mrs. Brown murmured, disbelief etched on her face. "It is. Look at this," the president said, pulling out his cell phone. The telegram threw to a delighted message from their son about his breakthrough at agriculture college with what looked like an on-campus photo. Seeing the proof, Mrs. Brown's resolution failed her, and she crumbled to the ground in surrender. "Please, I will dedicate my life to making up for this mistake. Is it possible that we can negotiate the contract to reopen negotiations?" I went to the president and shook hands. "We can pretend that the contract was never broken if Mrs. Brown agrees to stay out of management." The president let out an expression of relief. But Mrs. Brown was none too pleased and fixed a harsh, penetrating eye on me, preserved with antifreeze in effect through the years as I relate this story now, coldly proclaiming that our release papers were still good fair physical threats to us be damned. I would never reconsider rescinding the contract. Mrs. Brown's obstinacy was thick. That it all had been simply to enable her son to assume the presidency. I heavily exhale and tell her to read over the contract documents one more time. Turning towards my secretary, I asked for the copy given by Mrs. Brown. "Look at the signature part." I pointed to somewhere outside of where a signature should be. Mrs. Brown was stunned for a moment. Now, by what stretch of imagination is this not a nullification of the contract termination? "I wondered if your signature appearing in the left column, depending anywhere within a page and half-long form, and mine came along, embarrassingly signed one time for too much haste at bottom of it, that neither location turned out to be yours after again, turning up with coughing and staring rather than saying, 'Thank you.' However, Mrs. Brown, you forgot about it too. So we were on the same level, right, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Brown said nothing as she pondered this information. "It was an opportunity, isn't it?" I gave him a tip. A person who cannot turn pages of the contract document may not work as manager. With those words, the president quickly reached down to grab a document that he tossed on the floor and then looked it over before breaking out into laughter. He repeated, thank you so much." Mrs. Brown, sitting beside the president as he expressed his appreciation, looked somewhat abashed by comparison.